And now let's talk about nuclear weapons tests in Australia. Now, Australia has never had its own nuclear weapons and has no plans to get nuclear weapons. There are plans to have nuclear-powered submarines, but they don't carry atomic bombs, they just use nuclear power to move around. But there were nuclear tests in Australia done by the United Kingdom, by England. Back in the 1950s, the United Kingdom wanted to have their own nuclear weapons, but understandably a small island is not a good place to test nuclear weapons. So they asked Australia if they could test nuclear weapons in Australia, and Australia agreed. That would not happen today, but back then Australia very much saw itself as part of the United Kingdom. Most people in Australia had British ancestry. The United Kingdom was Australia's biggest trading partner, and the Australians felt that the British might share some nuclear technology with them which might be helpful for energy in Australia. No, they actually didn't. Our tests were first carried out in the Montebello Islands off the coast of Western Australia, and then at Emu Field, and then mostly at Maralinga in outback South Australia between 1952 and 1963. Now, the British chose this area because they thought, oh, it's empty, it's desert land, there's nobody there. The quote is, "This land is worthless and uninhabitable forever." Now, while it might have been worthless to the British, they couldn't farm it or mine it, it was definitely not worthless to the people who lived there. There were indigenous Aboriginal people who routinely travelled across these areas and used them for traditional practices, cultural, religious, food gathering and many other things. So the British might have thought it was worthless and uninhabitable, and so no problem if we'd set off atom bombs in it, but that's definitely not what the indigenous people thought. And this is common across many of these tests. The needs of the indigenous people, whether it be Pacific Islanders or the people in Xinjiang or Kazakhstan, were just ignored by the people testing their atomic weapons. So the idea was that any indigenous people living there were supposed to be relocated. The indigenous people in these areas are mostly living a traditional lifestyle in this very arid deserts. They would wander around and find food, set up temporary camps and then move on. The idea was to relocate them. Let's move them somewhere else. After all, one bit of desert is like another. But of course to the indigenous people that was not true at all. These were their ancestral lands. Their ancestors had been there for tens of thousands of years. Every rock and mountain and creek had religious, spiritual significance. And it was also very hard to find them. How do you find people scattered across thousands of square kilometres? I mean, they might have tried a good job to do it, but they didn't. They just got one person whose job it was to drive around, actually in his own car, he wasn't even given a government car, and find all the people spread over thousands of square kilometres and get them out, which almost certainly did not happen.